Good evening. Welcome to CGTN at the Table. I'm Day1. This program is a sidebar program for the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. In this program, I invite CGTN's reporter and editor in analyzing and assessing the policies made during the event. Today is the day one of the event, and the Chinese media almost overwhelmed by the important things being said during the meetings. So what are those meetings? What kind of effect are those things being promised during the meetings going to have on the future cooperation between China and African countries? Today in the studio joining me is my colleague Tang Bo, who is a reporter from CGTN and have been traveling around Africa, and also my guest from Nairobi office, Lindy Ngana. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much for having us.
And let me pick up a few lines from Chinese President Xi's speech during these two meetings today, and one afternoon, another one in the morning. One is about the business cooperation. The afternoon one is about, it's more general, it's more comprehensive. And my first question to you is that President Xi said that China does not attach any political strings to its investment in Africa under the Belt and Road Initiative. We've been talking a lot about Belt and Road Initiative, actually. And he said, and I quote, "Nor does it interfere in African countries' internal affairs or impose its demands on others." So my first question is, why do you think that China feels there's a necessity to make this clear?
Well, Dean, I think this comes from the fact that there was, particularly in the first decade of China-Africa relations and engagement, a perception that China was perhaps buying its way into Africa, that it perhaps was giving, leaders or presidents a little bit of money on the side in order to access the resources in the ground or things like that. And I think it's important to make it clear because, first of all, that perception is actually condescending in the way that it imagines African leaders as one group of corrupt people, and there's different practices and different presidents and different legislation and different policies, but certainly this idea that Africa as a continent can be just bought, I think is incredibly condescending. But secondly, of course, I think the need to emphasize that is that Africa has entered into these relationships or engagements or deals with China on its own volition, on its own choice, working towards its own strategy for development. And I think it was really important that President Xi highlighted that really emphasizes the sense that we step into this as equal partners.
Yeah, their own choice is very important, is a key point, because 2 days ago I interviewed the Rwandan foreign minister in Beijing, and I asked a question that there has been reports saying that China-Africa cooperation represents a new model of South-to-South cooperation, but at the same time some media say it's just a neo-colonialist plot. So what are her thoughts on that? And she said that what China has been doing in Africa is very different, and it does not impose any condition to the countries that is helping. And he said that it's just the Western major power, they're not quite used to the place where they have been there for so many years that have been, get much influence from China. So that's the reason why there are kind of a criticism about China's. Some people said that even Africa countries have been trapped in a Chinese debt, and also asking what if there's a humanitarian crisis. But when it comes to economic and social development, it is very important for them to make their own choice, along with the national conditions.
Of course, and I think on that, in terms of people saying that this is Africa being colonized again, but this time by China, what they forget is that when colonization happened, Africa wasn't at the table. It wasn't like we were sitting there with England negotiating how to colonize our countries, but this time we are at the table. That's the key difference, is that we're constantly strategizing with China, bringing up deals of our own or ideas or talking about our desires or our needs. This is not something where China's sitting in a room just planning, Africa's future without Africa.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The Rwanda Foreign Minister added that if Africa again colonized by China, and that's Africa's fault.
And what do you think that actually this case, the Chinese case, is more convincing? Because I'm sure that in the colonial period of time and in Africa and the former colonial powers, they would try to maintain a facade that actually came here to help. Well, in the meantime, actually, they extract materials and all sorts of wealth from the continent. But what actually made Chinese case more convincing? What to make an African people believe what Chinese people and the Chinese government says?
And maybe it comes off of what you said, that if Africa gets colonized again, then it's Africa's fault. Because I think, to be honest, Africans are not in a position to ever let that happen again. So I think you know, in a sense, we are more critical, we are more skeptical, or, you know what I mean? Like, we do assess what the situation is, or we do query this relationship, and so far, Africans have not pushed China out. If there was a reason to, it would have happened, do you know what I mean? Or we would start seeing signs of some kind of resistance. But the fact is, Africans largely have been open to it because they too stand to benefit, whether it's businesses that are trading with China from Africa, or African business people that have moved here to help bring, you know, sort of bring business partners together, whether it's students coming to studying, you know, through scholarships or university programs or learnership programs. Africans are benefiting, and I think that's probably the key the key reason as to why Africa is really, really open to China.
So from African country people's perspective, we might be frauded once, but we will never be frauded twice.
Yes.
Again. And my second question is also about the initiatives. And the President Xi said that China and Africa's joint development of the Belt and Road completely follows established international rules. And can you share your opinions about what actually are the international rules that China now sticks to?
Well, I think it's different, maybe country to country, how it is that one country might make a deal with China. For instance, there's a lot of focus on employment for local people, so that when Chinese businesses do come into certain African countries, there will be an expectation that local people become the bulk of that, sort of the bulk of the people, of the labor force that's used in a particular project. I mean, that's just one example. But certainly in many other spaces, environmental concerns are an issue, where China might be, for instance, be involved in fisheries or might be involved in mining. They would have to abide by the environmental protection laws that exist in those particular countries. And so those are just at least two examples.
Well, this is like trying to define the international laws. It's very difficult to find out what exactly is the international rules, established one. But to my understanding, it's all about the cooperation where all parties are happy and get respected.
Yeah.
When we were in South Africa, Port Elizabeth, we interviewed a refugee from the Democratic Republic of Congo who fled his homeland and went to South Africa. And he managed to find a job at China's first auto works in Port Elizabeth. He was hopeless, but then he kind of got a new life for working for the Chinese enterprises. But what the Chinese enterprises there are doing is not trying to just establish a working relations with the employers and employees, but helping them with their lives from all aspects. He moved his entire life from the Democratic Republic of Congo to South Africa, and he got his savings, he rented an apartment, paid the bills, then he brought his wife and children to South Africa, and now their biggest plan is to buy a new apartment to send their children to the best school of the city. So his life changed.
So by what you mean is that the international rules means that the corporation must take care of people's life and their rights.
Exactly.
Not just about the business, not just about the profit or interest. But I think we have to admit, even for China, China itself is still a developing country, and some of the international rules are not set up by China. Neither are they set up by African countries, and they are set up by developed countries. And we have to say that those rules, those standards are very high. Even China itself is reaching to meet the rules, to meet the demands. But do you think that it's reasonable, it is plausible for China and African countries, most of these countries, all of these countries are developing, are still developing, is it reasonable for them to reach that high a standard?
I mean, I think so, to the extent that both China and African countries are often party to similar international obligations, or, you know, sort of, whether it's through the World Trade Organization or through the United Nations, that we abide by very similar international laws. But I think in terms of what Africa and China have in common, as you've mentioned, is that we are developing countries. So when we sit together, we can set agendas that really, really speak to our personal objectives. We're about prosperity, we're about peace, we're about integration, we're about unity, do you know what I mean? And so maybe that's not important to developed countries, for instance, like the United States or whoever.
Exactly.
But for us, this is important. So we'll create our own rules when we sit down at the table, when we decide, okay, we're doing this together, you know?
And
so we have our
this is the reason why
blueprint.
the summit this time is also touched upon the African Union's 2063 agenda, and also the UN's 2030 development agenda for sustainable development. So we are trying to build a much stronger community between China and Africa. We don't have to always follow the Western major powers.
Exactly.
We set our new ones.
Open to local, based on your experience there, do Chinese companies investing there or working there, do they have any sort of regulations for Chinese staff working there? Because they're, like we've been talking for many times, so there's a culture difference. That sometimes the Chinese workers do not necessarily understand the difference because of language difference. So have you seen any this kind of disciplines put in place in order to kind of regulate the conduct of Chinese workers?
We spent 6 weeks there. We visited so many Chinese enterprises and also interviewed so many local employees. But I didn't see any written regulations and rules saying that you should do this, you should do that. So no such things. But I can easily sense the very friendly working environment among those Chinese employees and African employees. Just like I mentioned, the refugee case is a perfect example of explaining all this. They don't have exactly regulations and rules saying that you should do this and you should do that, but still, the environment is very touching and very friendly.
Okay, let's move on to slightly sensitive stuff. China is going to provide $60 billion worth of financial support to Africa. That is also part of the President's speech this afternoon. And the finance aid will be through government aid, financing and investment by financial institutions and enterprises. We've been monitoring the reactions by other news agencies and governments across the world towards China's financial help provided to African countries, and I have to say that the attitude from outside China and outside Africa isn't always as promising or as friendly or as positive as it's in China or in Africa. So why do they have this? Why those observers from the so-called the traditional Western sphere of the globe have this kind of concern?
I think one of the biggest criticisms that emerges is often this notion that China is going to land African countries in massive debt. But one must remember that some of the countries that might land up in a lot of debt are countries that were already experiencing massive economic downfall. It's not just money from China alone that lands these countries in situations that become what they call debt distress. It's often the political environment. There might be some kind of conflict, or terrorism is another factor. But in the instances, what came out today, which was something really commendable that came out today, was that low-income countries, particularly low-income countries that are engaging with China, I think are going to receive interest-free, although interest is going to be wiped out. I think that there was an announcement, I think I made a note
South Africa's least developed countries and heavily indebted countries developing countries and the small island developing countries with diplomatic relations with China will be exempted from outstanding intergovernmental interest-free loan debts from the end of 2018.
So I think that made it very clear that China is aware of the number of, there's not even that many, to be honest. I think it's Djibouti was one of them, might be Zambia is another, in which 70% of that country's debt is actually owed to China. China is very much aware of this. It's not out there to ruin these countries or land them in such terrible debt that they can't cope. And being aware of it, it said, okay, so this is what we're going to do, because we still want to work with you, we still want to partner with you. Let's create this debt exemption and help you recover from this debt situation. So it's actually a really great thing that China would do so, like still give $60 billion, but very aware of some of the challenges that particular countries face, and challenges that were not caused exclusively by China's involvement in their country,
Well, but I think there is a compatible existence between Chinese financial institutions and the foreign ones. We know that last year, many international rating agencies downgraded South Africa's credit ratings. So that has made the investment cost in South Africa very high. And also because South Africa has been going through economic downturn. So fundraising pressures in the country intensifies. But the good thing is that China has relatively high credit rating. So many local financial institutions, international financial institutions, and Chinese ones raise funds through Chinese banks to help companies like Eskom.
In those countries you visited, how robust is the local financial infrastructure? Like a bank service, do local people have a very easy access to bank loans or bank credit?
Well, that's still not a big problem. Everyone has easy access to their own bank account. It's just like how to maintain a stability of the financial market, like in South Africa. It's good to see that the Ascom company cope with its corruption situation, and then many international lenders and domestic lenders started to open up to it, and then the company is able to continue with its development plan, including expanding its transition network and also helping other African countries, including Nigeria, to establish their own power plants and expand the power grid. So that's very impressive.
And another issue I think is slightly worrying about this mindset of this, there has to be a war, maybe a metaphorical war between China and the Western so-called developed countries in this new frontier that is in Africa. That mindset is a bit worrying. I mean, does this have to be the case? Does China have to be in the competition with developed countries in Africa, or can they co-work with each other?
Well, I mean, among those 5 main speeches at the opening ceremony, one of them was Paul Kagame, who spoke in his capacity as the chairperson of the African Union, and he said this is not a zero-sum game. It's not all or nothing that Africa is partnering with China and no one else. He basically said that the gains of cooperation are available to anybody that wants to partner with Africa. So it's just a matter of their own will, their own desire to, come to the table and talk to Africa and China or anyone else for that matter.
Yeah, I don't see reason for war when there is a very compatible coexistence in the continent.
Yeah, exactly.
During your visit, have you seen that a Chinese restaurant standing next to shoulder by shoulder with a McDonald's or KFC there?
Yeah, that's not difficult to find. But what I'm trying to say is that, I'm very grateful that I got the chance to visit the continent. That's the place I have always wanted to visit, but I didn't know how to start with by myself. But in 2016, I visited Seychelles. Seychelles, a nice place to stay, nice food,
very
nice
expensive
beach to chill out. But I didn't manage to, reach out to the local people to make local contacts. So what I knew about Africa is very limited. But this time, 6 weeks in Africa, I get to know so many interesting stories. And I have a completely different understanding and thorough understanding of this continent. Very amazing place.
What is the biggest change in your mind before and after the trip?
For example, I think South Africa is the only developed society there, but actually many other countries, including Rwanda, including Namibia, Zimbabwe, they have a very nice and very well improved economic growth. It's very impressive. Like, we flew to the capital city of Namibia, Windhoek, and we drove all the way to Windhoek to the coastal city of Walvis Bay, the second largest city of Namibia. And through the entire trip, I kept telling my driver that, oh my God, this is like American countryside. Oh my God, this is like a European countryside. The city, the people there are so well organized and well disciplined. It blew my mind. Yeah.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your insights. Thank you. And that's pretty much about today's show. And tomorrow is also another big day. It's the second day of the forum, and tomorrow we expect there's a big announcement of the meeting, and a lot of promise will be inked in that announcement. And again, tomorrow we will have actually 4 people in the studio talking about the forum. And stay tuned to CGTN. You can find us on all platforms, including the digital ones on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, microblog, and as well as the application. Also, we will have the full coverage of the event on the TV, the CGTN channel as well. So if you have anything you would like us to ask for you, then feel free to leave them in the comment section. We will reach out for you as soon as we receive them. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your company, and thank you for insights. Good night.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a nice conversation.
Yeah,
good chat.
Thank you.
I think I can safely say that you were so far one of the best of my guests.
Thank you. No, Lindy's here. I'm not the best. No.